Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's event. Very excited to have you join us today. So, we're going to be discussing a challenge that I'm sure is all too familiar to most of you, and that is the FinOps execution gap. What we mean by that is that every FinOps team has dashboards and recommendations, and yet cloud waste still persists. We're going to explore why that is and what you can do about it. I'm super excited about the panel of experts that we've assembled today to dig into the real reasons that FinOps recommendations don't always translate into action. I find this a really fascinating topic because it encompasses aspects that span organizational culture, human psychology, and technology. So, with that, I'm going to have our panelists come on camera and introduce themselves. So, Brendan, if you wouldn't mind starting, giving a quick introduction.
Sure, happy to do so. Brendan Putek, Director of DevOps and Security Operations at Relay Network. Strange person to be talking about FinOps, but it falls under my ownership there as well. Relay Network is a B2B2C MarTech channel platform, allowing our customers to connect with their customers to drive, outcomes for both sides. I've been here for about 9 years and implemented all of our FinOps processes. And I believe we've been a customer of Sedai now for about 5 years. So it's been quite the journey.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Brendan. Dieter.
Hey, I'm Dieter Mason. I've been working in cloud financial management since 2013 at companies like Google, Netflix, Intuit, and most recently Roku. I'm also one of the FinOps ambassadors.
Thanks, Dieter. Great to have you. And last but not least, Nikhil.
Hello, everyone. Nikhil Kurup. I am the SVP of Engineering here at Sedai. I kind of have a mixed background. I was a developer at some point in time. Then I went on to build scalable, highly scalable systems for enterprises, and then was a data scientist for a few years, which kind of puts me in an interesting position to understand the whole FinOps ecosystem because as a data scientist, I understand all the opportunities, all the data, all the signals. As an architect, I understand the pain in implementing those. And as a developer, I don't want to deal with any of this because I want to just build features and not care about cost. So I'm very excited about all the things that we have been doing at Sedai for the last 6 years, building out autonomous cloud management and hoping to bridge this gap for our customers. So excited to be here and happy to talk about this.
Awesome. Thanks, Nikhil. Before we dive into the discussion, just a couple of really quick housekeeping items. So first, be sure to stay until the end of the event because, and we're planning this to be a 45-minute event, but we are going to be giving away two pairs of these awesome noise canceling headphones. You will definitely want to be in the running for that. But also stay to the end because we are planning to spend some time answering your questions. So please submit your questions at any time using Zoom's Q&A feature, and we will get to as many as we can. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and just have the panelists on. And I want to start by just sort of defining the challenge a bit more and the reasons behind it. And Dieter, I want to start with you. So as a FinOps practitioner, you've sat at this intersection for a long time across multiple companies, as you mentioned. In your experience, what is the most common reason that a solid FinOps recommendation just never gets acted on?
Yeah, in my experience, there are two causes for that. One is when management does not give time to engineers to act on the recommendation, right? So they don't have permission or authorization, right? The other common reason is that the savings of the recommendations are less than it costs the engineer to investigate, right? And to overcome the first one, you need to work with executives, right? It has to come top down. And for the second one, where the savings are too small, you need to start using automation.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And Brendan, maybe to flip it around a little bit to the engineering side. So when FinOps or finance comes to your team with an optimization request, what's the typical reaction? What's the friction that makes it hard to prioritize that?
Yeah, it's right. It's one more request. right? Of a team that's already for in our case, right, trying to handle a number of different, requirements and areas and processes, to have, hey, a new request, we need to go figure this out, go dig into it, go determine what's going on so you can resolve it. You're asking again, hey, here's a new fire, go drop everything else, context switch, take the time to do this, but meet all your other deadlines as well, right? And things that you've been given, right? That's absolutely true. And I think, Dieter also hit on a big one is, management support on solving these problems. There's been a number of these sorts of cases that, I've personally raised that I've seen exactly that, right? The management support isn't there until it is, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and you bring up an important point. I mean, you guys you're busy, right? You've got a lot going on already. You've got a backlog of things. So just adding one more thing into the mix is not always easy. Nikhil, you work with a number of organizations who have kind of recognized that they're having this challenge and they're seeking solutions to it. What's your take? Why does this seem like such a hard problem to solve?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Dieter and Brendan said, right? I mean, there has to be organizational focus to address this problem and call it out and start attacking it. But even when organizations realize this is a problem they want to solve, there is still the challenge of who gets to do what, right? The people who's responsible with the problem is the FinOps team, and the one who needs to act on it is the engineering team, right? So what I feel like there is also a communication barrier between these two teams. The FinOps team thinks in terms of dollars and EBITDA and amortized spend, whereas the engineers think in P99 and latency and throughput, right? So how can you bridge that gap? How can they all speak the same language? FinOps team tried putting things in Jira, and it just becomes yet another core to the entire list, like Brendan was mentioning, right? So we need to get beyond that. We need to identify how can we bridge that communication gap. How do we make everyone understand the same problem and work towards the same solution, right? When FinOps team says hey, our cost is high, we need to reduce it. That's just like a doctor saying, "Oh, if you're sick, just get well soon, right? Don't fall sick." That doesn't help. It's perfectly meaningful, but it's not actionable, right? So how can you get to actionable and executable recommendations? How can you make it possible, right? So that I think that gap it's sort of a communication gap, but it's also a process gap and a tooling gap as well.
Yeah,
So I
I
feel
love
like tooling and automation and autonomous systems can kind of bridge that gap as long as everyone sees the same picture and talks the same language. It becomes a little bit more easier.
yeah, I love that. I love that analogy. I'm definitely going to steal that and start using it. And we're going to get into like you guys raised a lot of topics that I think we're going to dive into a little bit deeper. But real quick before we move on, do you guys think that it's fundamentally a people culture problem, a tooling problem, an incentive problem? Like very big picture, what do you think?
If you guys don't mind, I'll start. I think it's a structure and incentive problem, right? The separation of engineering teams from, right, financial responsibility, by putting that onto another team that's FinOps, right? It creates that gap there where like that's not their focus, that's not their metrics, that's not what they're measured on. Right. So they don't care about it. You see the same thing in the gap between security and engineering as well, right? The same problem. Security operations teams have a different focus and incentives and are separated from engineering teams. Right. And bringing the two together is, I think, we're getting ahead of myself maybe, but part of the answer there.
Yeah. Definitely makes sense. And that kind of brings us into a topic that I wanted to get into because I think it's a fascinating aspect, and that's the human psychology aspect of this. So let's talk about kind of the behavioral dynamics that make it harder to solve the problem. So Brendan, just kind of continuing on from, your thoughts and from an engineering leader's perspective, when someone proposes automating resource management or right sizing in production, what are the objections that you hear from your team and what does it take to get buy-in?
Yeah, so the usual objections are, right, what work does this mean for us, right? What potential, downsides are there for us, right? Could we see outages, pages, right? Have to replay data, issues like that, right? Especially if they're not in the tool, in the product, have access to the product to see what's happening, right? And to see how it's, doing what it's doing and making some of those decisions, right? It's essentially a trust issue. They don't understand the tool. They didn't choose the tool. They're not in the tool, right? And you're asking them again to do something that they're not, right? That's not their metric that they're being judged on at the end of the year for their performance, right? Why are they going to take that risk?
Yeah, it's a great point. And Dieter, I've heard you in other talks talk about the fear of being the one who causes a production incident. That's a topic that's near and dear to our heart. We have a campaign running right now about who touched prod because there's this fear of like, am I going to be the one to get blamed for this? And you can look at it as the cost of under provisioning is immediate, right? That's something that affects you right away. The cost of over provisioning as an engineer might not be that, impactful to you. So how do you actually change that equation for engineering teams?
Yeah, you definitely need buy-in from leadership, right? And I'm talking executives, not just your line managers or a team director, right? The executives need to understand what the good sides of cloud are and what the not so good sides of cloud are, right? Elasticity is good, waste not so good, right? And then the software engineers or engineers in general are fundamentally already used to optimizing, right? The P99 that was mentioned before, or latency, performance, those kind of things, right? Um, we need a culture shift where we ask the engineers to optimize for cost as well, right? And ultimately, when it comes to their objectives and key results or OKRs, right? How their performance is being judged by management, cost needs to become one of those factors as well. I think it will be easy because they are already used to optimizing. They just have to learn how to optimize for cost as well.
Yeah. And later, I mean, I totally agree with you, right? But that's where I also find there are challenges because if you ask an engineer to downsize a production database, they've done this in 2019 and there was a 4-hour outage, right? So that edit database button is like a live grenade button for them, right? So psychologically speaking, it's like something I will avoid at any cost. I don't want to live that trauma again, right? So it's also about incentives, but it's also about overcoming that fear a little bit as engineers, right? So we always try to be more cautious, but there is always a balance between how much more, how much there's a continuum between caution and doing the right thing, right? So it's also structuring the organization to do that, and that's what I think some organizations struggle to kind of materialize for their engineering team.
And
Agreed.
Yeah.
yeah, and you bring up a good topic, Nikhil, too, about just the psychology of the blame game and like how do you eliminate that sort of dynamic of finger pointing and blame and things like that. And Dieter, you brought up, getting like executive buy-in at a very high level. Does that kind of help with that, or how do you get to a culture where you're not in a position where there's finger pointing and blame going on?
Well, the finger pointing you can address by looking at the RCAs, right? And how you do the RCA, right? Is the goal to get a list of names, or is the goal to identify a list of practices, steps, or actions that need to be prevented?
Yeah.
That's so you need to shift from that, right? I worked at many organizations. I worked at organizations where the goal is to have a list of names for whatever purpose. It's not like you're going to immediately lay them off, right? So that's not very useful. But what did we do that we should not do again? That is the goal.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, right? And non-blame, right? Retrospectives on this sort of thing, right, are key determining what happened, what processes failed, who doesn't know something, right? Not because again you want to get rid of them, you have a training gap or an education gap that needs to be addressed. Rich, you talked about, some of the incentivizing, right? What's the best incentive for all employees? It's usually money, right? Well, at the end of the day, from an engineering perspective, right, one of the only real ways we have to impact the bottom line financials of a company is saving money, right? So cost expenditure, and most companies are going to find that their cloud expenses or things like that are the largest expense, right, that they have besides obviously people, right? And that can translate to real dollars in your engineers' pockets for bonuses or things like that at the end of the year.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And of course, also the giving them the opportunity to make those changes too, right? In a more controlled fashion. You don't want to put a gun to their head and say, okay, let's do all these optimizations in the next 24 hours, right? Training, again, making the right tools and the right opportunity to make those changes is also important, right? Because there's a lot of cognitive overload when it comes to the engineers too, right? Because there's so many other things that dealing with. This is just still another line item that they want to deal, right? So making them empowered to make those decisions and covering for them a little bit if and when things go south.
Yeah, and one quick thing I wanted to circle back on before we move on to talk about kind of the solutions. Dieter, you mentioned kind of having buy-in at a very high level in the organization. How high are we talking here? Because obviously FinOps is going to report up in one part of the organization, engineering in another part. So where are we talking about, making sure we have that executive level sponsorship?
It depends on your organization, right? It could be CTO, CIO, CFO typically is a good one too. And depending on the size or the culture of the organization, you might want to go with the CEO as well, right? I had at Intuit, I had quarterly meetings with the CTO and the CFO, right? And of course, you up level, right? A different language and different content is presented at that level, right? And you need to get used to it. But depending on the organization, at my current organization, the CEO would be more in the movie business, let's say, right? And less into cloud computing. So we do have while we don't have a CTO or CIO, we do have an equivalent EVP, and that's the person that I interact with.
Yeah, makes sense. And really good point about kind of elevating the conversation to the right level that you're talking to in the organization. All right, let's shift from talking about the problem. I think we've kind of gone through some of the kind of key aspects of defining the challenges here, but let's talk about the solutions. You've all been part of implementing solutions at different organizations. Dieter, you mentioned, you've led cloud financial management at Google, Netflix, Intuit, Roku. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of optimization initiatives, both successful and failures. So what in your mind determines whether an initiative actually sticks versus kind of dying after the proof of concept?
Yeah, so first of all, during your proof of concept, you need to do a little bit more than just installing the software and letting it run for like a couple days or weeks. What I see works best is look at some corner cases, right? So if something is scaling back in, so it's shrinking, and then you have an event where it needs to scale back out fast, right? Looking at how does a system react after a out-of-memory kill operation, right? Does it try again, or does it revert to the original configuration? Those kind of things. So think of all the corner cases and test them to get yourself familiar with the product, right? And see what it can and cannot do, right? And possibly have a conversation then with the vendor around feature requests and those kind of things. Then come up for the POC to turn into an operational thing. You will need a roadmap, right? And you need milestones or steps on that roadmap. And again, I would take that roadmap and first socialize it maybe with the engineering leaders, if applicable, right? That need to put engineering resources into action so that that roadmap can be executed. And then once you have that internal buy-in, right, from the engineering leader, go to the executives and tell them, hey, this is the roadmap and this has been blessed by the engineering leader, right? And typically when I interact with executives, they are very used to making decisions, right? That's basically what we pay them for, right? Why they get paid the big bucks like a CEO, right? Because the hope is that they will make good decisions for the business. So they are very used to making decisions. So provide more than one option. That's all I'm saying, right? Make sure that they can make a decision, and then once they make the decision, human psychology kicks back in, that they now feel that it is their decision and they will support it, right? And that will also ensure that the engineers have the required time to actually work on the implementation.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Brendan, what's your journey look like at Relay Network? What have you tried? What's failed? What's actually working?
Yeah, we've tried a couple of right tools or solutions or things like that along the way. And one of our biggest issues has always been visibility, right? Into what is our actual spend? How do you dig down into that and find out, how are these changes going to make an effect? Um, you know, our views maybe slightly different. It when we implemented right, technology like Sedai, it was less about the cost and more about the automation itself, right? And the ability to introduce scaling and not lay that cognitive burden on our engineering team, which for us is big. That enables them to move faster and get actual product out the door, and with a much, without having to spend that time. Hey, we've got to load test and validate all these scaling components and things like that. Right? We have now a tool that does that for us, which is fantastic. The larger cost initiatives, though, yeah, are very much about getting that executive buy-in, and how do you explain that to executives in a way that they understand, right? It's not just about then giving them I think the options to make decisions. What I've found is it's usually, right, it's less about here's what you get, right? And it's more about what risk are you averting, right? What's the downside that you are preventing by doing these projects? Because that's how most executives think. It's not in opportunities, it's in risk, right? And downside. So when we started to take that direction, we got a lot more buy-in for, right, accomplishing some of our larger projects that really required engineering time, to implement. They weren't as simple as like, hey, you can just scale this up and down. It was, no, we've got to go rebuild this entire component, for whatever reason, right? It's using an outdated version. We're self-hosting, right, software that nobody's an expert in, right? Whatever the case might be.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. And I think, a lot of times when we talk about optimization, the first thing people think about is cost, right? And reducing cost. But you really have to balance out cost, performance, availability, but also engineering time and effort, right? To make these things happen. It's kind of like the golden triangle type of thing, right? If you want to spend less, you may spend more on, your engineers' time, or you may risk performance issues as well. Nikhil, in your role at Sedai, you obviously work with a lot of engineering and FinOps teams. What separates the organizations that successfully close this gap from the ones that, stay stuck?
Yeah, I think the most successful teams I've seen are the ones who made a cultural shift from using FinOps as a reporting mechanism and naming and shaming, right? I mean, a lot of teams just get a monthly report from FinOps, and it's a blame game, or it's a name and shame, and it's kind of like walking into the principal's office and getting scolded at, right? The successful ones are the ones who moved away from that way of thinking and moved into more of a pit crew kind of mentality, right? Hey, we are all working on the same problem. Let's just make sure that this car runs as smooth as possible without blowing out the engine, right? So once everyone's kind of aligned to doing that, then everyone has a very well-defined role and a goal that can be measured, right? So it's a little bit of cultural shift, and also it's about tooling, right? It's about not waiting for a month to see the report. I made a change. What is the impact on cost? And getting visibility immediately and in a very reliable and a repeatable manner, right? What are the tooling that can help you change the burden of ownership? So if I change, I know what I need to do. I need to resize this, right? Okay, then let the Kubernetes cluster take care of bin packing, right? So solving the problem that you can address and letting tools and technology and processes, etc., take care of the fundamentals. So it's a adoption of cultural change, tools and policies that kind of, I think, helps the most successful organization adapt these processes.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so speaking of tooling and technology, let's talk about the role of automation, autonomy, AI, all of these things that are obviously very hot topics right now, and really how it relates to trust and security as well. So Nikhil, I want to start with you this time because obviously autonomous ML-driven optimization is at the heart of what Sedai does. And I'm sure you've seen that engineers can be naturally skeptical of autonomous reliability and optimization. So what are the keys to kind of building trust?
Yeah, I think the phrasing there is engineers aren't really scared of autonomous or AI. They love building those systems, right? What they really are concerned about is unpredictability and the lack of safety, right? No SRE wants to be woken up in the middle of the night just because an autonomous system caused an outage, right? What they need is guarantees and safety from a system that does this thing autonomously. How can they ensure that certain guardrails are set, right? Their SREs are typically used to play the role of a gatekeeper to prevent things from impacting the system, right? Instead, they need to channel it more of, okay, can I put guardrails so that an autonomous system can work there, right? So it's a little bit of establishing that trust so that you can make those changes and let an autonomous or AI system take care of making some of those changes. And part of it is also we all agree that the reasons organizations suffer is not because they don't know what to change. It's just because of the sheer volume of it, right? I mean, I'm a firm believer that we have reached a point where it is humanly impossible to optimize your environment manually, right? You need some kind of help. That's where autonomous systems and well-defined, well set up AI systems can really help you close that gap, right? So it's safety, it's explainability, it's end of the day building trust in a safe system. That is where the gap is right now, and that's kind of where we are hoping at Sedai. We are kind of building those kind of systems that can help establish that safety and trust.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Brendan, as an engineering leader, what guardrails or transparency do you need to see before you feel comfortable letting an autonomous system manage resources at scale in production?
Yeah, so you mentioned, right, the rise of AI and autonomous, right, solutioning and remediation in this space, right? And as I said, I also manage security. That's a really big thing there. And I take the same view across the board, right? Is I need provenance. I need to be able to see what decisions are being made by any sort of tool that is going to make real-time changes to my production environments, right? I need to be able to understand that. I need to be able to verify that, right? And I need to be able to see that, hopefully at scale, right? Hey, you're doing this look across how many organizations and their data and anonymizing that to make your decisions of, is this change safe in what we see? Right. Typically, that way I can go look at that and I can audit and I can say, okay, here's exactly what happened. Right. And if I do have a problem, for whatever reason, I've got a trusted partner that I can go to with that data and say, hey, right, this happened, right? You have all the data, you've got all the information, right? Like, how do we prevent this from happening again? We talked earlier about, right, the non-blame after action. Right. That's the same view with your ISV partners, right, as it is with your own engineers, right? We're all building, software or solutions, and right, we're all going to make some level of mistakes, and it's about solving them and moving forward successfully, right? Not pointing fingers, but it's primarily about visibility and understanding for trust.
Yeah. Makes sense. And Dieter, as someone who's evaluated multiple solutions in this space, so what criteria do you use to assess whether an automation tool is actually safe for production? Like what does earning trust actually look like to you before you would recommend something organization-wide?
Yeah, so when it comes to rolling out automation solutions, right? One thing that I mentioned before that is useful is that you test the corner cases because here during the rollout, you want to avoid surprises, right? You don't want to roll this out in any environment and then all of a sudden, oh, on Mondays, there is a maintenance window, it just shuts down for an hour or something, right? So you need to be aware of the tool's capabilities, what it can and cannot do. So to have that confidence to get started on the rollout. And then start with non-production environments first, right? There is where you can build the training required because every tool is a little bit different, right? Your engineers need to get experience with the tool, but you can also build the confidence, right? Hey, this has been running in non-production environments for 12 months now. What are we waiting for, right? And you take it from there. Then it is also, again, the human psychology comes in. It is important to socialize success stories, right? If an engineering team was able to migrate and they are now running in production, fantastic, you have a good showcase here, right? And you can have one of those engineers talk to other engineers, right? And that will build trust and it will also promote adoption. If, for example, if that engineer can share, hey, we were able to save, I don't know, 20%, 30% or something like this, right? Now the other engineers have that on their objectives and key results, right? And they want to look good to their management, right? So this is how you can move this forward.
Yeah. That's really a good insight, and I can't believe how fast the time has gone here. I do want to get to some audience questions, but I think we've covered a lot of great aspects of this challenge. Again, kind of spanning cultural, psychological, tooling, and all of that. So we do have some audience questions though, so I do want to spend a few minutes just getting to those. The first one here is, um, I think we covered a little bit of this ground already, but maybe just to reiterate or to restate some thoughts here. But how do you handle a team that is resistant to automation even after you've shown them it's safe? And I'll throw that out there for whoever would like to take a stab at it and comment.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk to that. I've dealt with some of that. Right, the end answer for that is I just went around them. Right, I went to their manager, right, in those cases, right, whoever, right, the engineering manager for that team or whatever, right. I went above them and said, hey, look, we've run this, we've tested this, it's safe, right? We just want to turn it on, right? Let's set a date that we're going to do that and put it on the calendar and flip that switch, right? Maybe not the most politically savvy solution, right? But it does certainly work, right? And everybody in the organization then sees the benefits, right, for the end result.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one way to do it, Brendan, of course. But the way that we talk about it a little bit more of is getting there. It's a journey, right? Autonomous or optimization. These are all journeys, and the most important thing is to take it one step at a time, right? Don't boil the ocean. What can we do? What's something small we can prove out? Like later you're saying, right? Can we prove out something in test and let it run? Maybe not even autonomously, right? Can I actually click it and see it in action, right? Can I see what's happening? So if I see that enough times, I know that, okay, when I click it, it's going to work, right? And then you are just getting into the habit of just clicking a button and say, why do I need to do that? Why can't I just turn it on autonomous, right? So it's a journey. It's a process of getting there. And that's one way to build that trust, right? As long as the fundamentals and the explainability and the safety and everything is in place, then that's a journey, a process to kind of build that trust. So that's another way to get to it, I guess.
Yeah, I should clarify. I wouldn't do the first process without having gone through
Having
that
gone through that process. Right, right.
first, right? doing the testing and things like that in lower environments, validating, right, trying to build that trust, right? But ultimately, at some point, if that is an organization's
Yeah.
right, goal to solve, and you've got one particular group blocking that, right? That's when I would then say, hey, I'm just going to go above you to the person, right, who you report to or whatever, and be like, hey, and I'm not even going to mention you're not doing it, just like I want to get this done.
Yeah. At some point, you have to be pragmatic about it too. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I love this next question. If you're familiar with DevOps, you're obviously familiar with the concept of you build it, you run it. Is there a FinOps equivalent of you build it, you run it? Some way to make engineers, basically own or feel the cost of their own infrastructure?
I can take this one, right? So you can't directly use cloud cost, right? Because last month you spent $1,000, this month you spent $1,100, but maybe you had more customers, more users, something like that. So you need a KPI to normalize this, right? Cost per streaming hour, cost per ad served, cost per tax return, those kind of things, right? And then if your KPI increases, right, cost per streaming hour increases, then that is the problem, right? Now you have that normalization and you see that there is an increase. Sometimes that can be justified with, we added a feature that provides a better user experience, right? Or sometimes you just used a virtual machine that is too large, right? And you need to right size this thing. But that is a good way, essentially, the unit economics, right? Use that to help you with that journey.
Yeah, I think that's very organizationally dependent, right? Because the size, the maturity, right, of an organization really makes some of those determinations. It could be as simple, right? Some of the metrics, right? Like what's your margin per customer, right? If you're looking at it that way, and depending on how you're architected and structured. Right. But I also think there's a level where this is very much cultural and about how you build your engineering team and instill these concepts into your engineering team, right? The same ideas as secure by design, secure by inception, right, should apply to your cost, right? Hey, right sizing, upfront, doing your at least thought exercises when you're designing new features or components to say, what do we actually extrapolate this cost is going to be? A lot of organizations don't do that, and then they release a new feature, and then they're very surprised by what the actual cost is afterwards. And this is an easy way to do that, and right, give your engineering team some skin in the game, right? The other one is to look at, some of the integrations into your CI/CD process for things to say, okay, right, you're doing infrastructure as code. What is the estimate of what this is going to cost and what the cost differential is going to be? So you can at least flag it. So somebody has to go put eyes on it and review it, right, before it could potentially move forward if it's a large enough cost increase.
Awesome. Well, I wish we had time for more audience questions, but I have one more question that I want each of you to answer to kind of sum things up a little bit. And the final question, I'll give each of you a minute to answer, is if you could give one piece of advice to someone sitting in the audience right now who is kind of stuck in this FinOps engineering gap, either whether they're on the FinOps side or the engineering side, or whether they kind of span both sides, what would that one piece of advice be? And Brendan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think for mine, it's, we talked about getting buy-in, and it would tie to that, right? And, the way to motivate engineers and, employees who are typically considered, right, parts of cost centers on how they can actually materially affect the bottom line of the business and what the actual material benefits of that are to them, right? Because more money in everybody's pocket is usually a pretty motivating factor to look at and solve these problems.
Yeah, definitely motivates me. Dieter, how about you?
Yeah, when I think about that, I would suggest, involve your executives more, if at all possible, right? or go as high as you are able to in the management chain. Ideally, not just your own manager, right? Because you don't want to do these activities, whether it be FinOps or optimizations, in a vacuum, right? Get executives sponsorship and track successes, right? And build trust over time.
Yeah. And I think getting that executive sponsorship can help your own career as well, right? Because you're really starting to speak a different, at a different level and a different language. So I think it's good advice, not just for, closing that gap, but also from a career, perspective too. Nikhil, how about you?
Yeah, I would say pretty much what I was talking about earlier, right? And just do it. Just take the next step. Just take a small step, right? Try out what you haven't yet, right? Having a bunch of things in your backlog and not being acted upon is not helping anyone, right? What can you do? What are the tools out there? What can AI help you with? What can autonomous systems help you with? Take a small step, right? Something small, much more control that you can manage. Take that, prove it out, build confidence, and then do it over and over again, right? Find out the toolings. I'm not shilling for Sedai here, but kind of thinking in the way we kind of got here with Sedai, right? Some of those thought process will help in going a long way in kind of solving these problems. And again, doesn't have to be Sedai, right? There are plenty of other options you can consider. But taking that first step, I think, is the most critical thing anyone can do today.
Yeah, love that. Just do it. Well, hey, I want to thank you guys so much. I'm just going to pull my slide back up here. Brendan, Dieter, Nikhil, thank you guys so much for taking the time today and sharing your experience and your expertise and your insights. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience did too. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to say a quick word about Sedai. So today's conversation wasn't a product pitch at all. It was meant to be a real discussion about a problem that is frustrating a lot of teams right now. But closing the FinOps execution gap is exactly what Sedai is built to do, helping engineering and FinOps teams move from recommendations to action safely and autonomously. So if anything that we discussed today resonated, I would encourage you to visit sedai.io and book a demo. We would love to be able to show you what it looks like in practice. And finally, last but not least, let's give away those headphones. So I have actually chosen a couple of attendees at random, and the lucky winners are Nadir Doctor and Scott Meyer. I hope I got the names right there. But Nadir and Scott, we will reach out to you via email to get your details to share the prize with you. So once again, thank you to all our panelists, and thank you all for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. Take care.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.